Good to be here this morning. Good to be hearing all the young voices. We hear lots of babies now. That is a blessing. Hopefully that will be here for many years to come. That doesn't get old. It's one of those things where at first it's kind of like, wait, I can't what's going on, and then eventually you kind of get used to it, and it's just like, okay. But it's certainly a blessing, and thank you, young moms, for all that you do in bringing your children and taking care of them. And hopefully you can get something out of our studies this morning. We're going to be in Matthew chapter 17 this morning. And continuing where we left off, as Jesus has been training his disciples. As we go through this section of Matthew, I really want us to pay attention to some of the lessons that Jesus is giving to his disciples. And I think we're going to get some very valuable lessons in the very short study, very short text that we're going to be looking at this morning. We live in the land of the free, right? We have all these blessings in America and all these freedoms at our disposal that we can take advantage of. And it may not seem like that sometimes, and there are some cases where it may feel like people may be trying to take away freedoms and lots of things going on in the world around us. But the truth is, we are extremely blessed as a nation, and we have freedoms that are not found all over the world. I mean, we're given abilities and opportunities that not many people on earth have. So hopefully we're grateful for those freedoms that we have, but how should those who are disciples of Christ view their freedoms? How should we think about the freedoms that we're given on earth in light of what God has done for us and what Christ has done for us? Well, that's really what we're going to be thinking about and formulating as we study the text this morning, Matthew 17. Let's start reading verses 24 and beginning of verse 25. It says, "At that time the disciples came to Jesus, saying," I'm in chapter 18. "When they came to Capernaum, the collectors of the 2 drachma tax went up to Peter and said, 'Does your teacher not pay the tax?' He said, 'Yes.'" Now pause just a second. What is this? If you've got a different translation, you may be seeing a little bit of different wording here, but notice, "Does your teacher not pay the tax?" There's an expectation that Jesus would pay the tax, and he's not paid it, and they're wondering what's going on. Well, what is this tax? ESV just says the 2 drachma tax. And in other translations, it'll go ahead and tell you that the 2 drachma tax is the once-a-year tax that was imposed for the upkeep of the temple. The drachma was about a day's wage, so they would have to pay 2 of their day's wages per year just for the upkeep of the temple. And so he's asking, is your teacher not going to pay this? You kind of wonder, has Jesus not paid it yet? You notice he comes to Capernaum. Maybe he's been away at Caesarea Philippi, and now he's returning to Capernaum, and maybe he's a little bit late on his payment of this tax. Well, think for just a second about this. The man's asking, is Jesus going to pay a temple tax? Should Jesus pay this tax? Does that make sense for Jesus to pay this tax? I mean, think about the temple. Later on in chapter 22, he's going to state that the temple is corrupt, that it's a den of robbers. What an opportunity, right? We're not going to pay this tax because of the corruption of the temple, a way of protesting the temple. Maybe this is his opportunity for that. Well, actually, as we study this a little bit more, we kind of learn that this is a tax that was not an obligation. Notice it is people who are upkeeping the temple. These are Jews who are coming to try to give this tax, to try to receive money for this tax. This actually wasn't instituted until the book of Nehemiah, after the temple was reconstructed. And they kept this going for a long time. And it seems to be this voluntary thing. In fact, as we look at history, we see that rabbis were exempt from this tax. They didn't have to pay. The Sadducees just didn't pay it altogether. But none of the rabbis were really had to pay. They paid like once in their whole lifetime, and that was it. And the poor didn't have to pay. And so we kind of wonder, why would Jesus pay this tax? I mean, why would the tax collector come to Jesus and ask him if he might have been exempt? Well, obviously, there's also the fact that Jesus is the temple. You ever think about that as you read in this text we just studied earlier in chapter 17, verse 2? He was transfigured before Peter and James and John, and he showed himself as having God dwelling inside of him. He is essentially the temple of God. And here he is being asked, are you going to pay the temple tax? Of course, he doesn't ask Jesus this. He asked Peter this. Peter, who was on the mountain, who saw who Jesus was. So why should Jesus pay this tax? It doesn't make any sense for him to pay this tax. He is the temple, so why would he pay for that temple, which is corrupt and messed up? And he's got so many reasons not to pay. And how many of us like to pay any kind of tax that we don't have to pay? No, we are out of that. We want to get away from that as much as possible. Yet Peter tells the man, yes. Peter says yes. The teacher does pay this tax. Interesting. Notice what happens as you continue, verse 25. It says, "And when he came into the house, Jesus spoke to him first, saying, 'What do you think, Simon? From whom do kings of the earth take toll or tax? From their sons or from others?' And when he said from others, Jesus said to him, 'Then the sons are free.'" Pause right there. So think about this. So Peter comes in, and before Peter can get a word out, Jesus speaks to him, and he tells them this kind of a parable. The kings of earth, who do they tax? You're just like, what are you, we live in a democracy. This is not, what are you talking about? Well, the kings of earth do not tax their sons. They pay for their sons, right? They're taking care of their sons and their families with the money that belongs to everybody else. So the kings of earth do not tax their sons. And so Peter rightly says they tax other people. And then Jesus comes back and says, okay, so then the sons are free. Well, why does he make this point? Why does he bring up this parable? What does this have to do with this 2 drachma tax? Well, we just learned quite a bit about Jesus over the last few weeks. You remember back in chapter 16, verse 16, where Jesus had asked the disciples, "Who do they say that I am?" And then he asked, "Who do you say that I am?" And Peter says, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." And in chapter 17, verse 5, we see God himself telling the disciples, "This is my beloved Son with whom I am well pleased." Okay, so the sons are free. The sons don't have to pay the tax. So here is another reason why Jesus should not have to pay this tax. He is the Son of God. And as the Son of God, he should be exempted from the tax that God has brought down on his people, if that's really what's going on with this tax. He should be completely free from this tax. Notice how Jesus is revealing to Peter what the situation is really like after Peter's already made the obligation. Yes, my teacher pays the tax. Jesus reveals to him, I really don't have to pay this tax. It's not something that I have to do. Look at the last verse 27. He says, "However, not to give offense to them, go to the sea and cast a hook and take the first fish that comes up. And when you open its mouth, you will find a shekel. Take that and give it to them for me and for yourself." Notice Jesus says, I'm going to pay the tax. He doesn't have to. He's a son. He is free from this. He doesn't have to pay any tax. And he doesn't support the corruption that's going on in the temple. And now we kind of figure out he doesn't really have any money. He doesn't say go to the money bag and give them the money. He says you go fishing and you're going to catch a fish and that's how you're going to have the money. But Jesus has decided, I'm going to pay this tax. Isn't that interesting? Well, what's the reason for this? If he didn't have to pay the tax, why does he choose to pay the tax? Notice that phrase right there at the beginning of verse 27. However, not to give offense to them. Jesus' whole reason for paying the tax is to keep from offending those who are collecting the tax. To keep them from thinking negatively about him and his mission and his ministry. And so he tells Peter, why don't you go catch a fish, and whenever you open the mouth, you're going to find the money that's needed for the tax. And notice how that's how it ends. You'll find the money, a shekel will be in there that will pay for me and for you for this tax. And then we don't read about Peter going and casting the hook, and sure enough, there's the shekel in the mouth of the fish. We just assume that's what happens next. So what is this all about? There's three teaching points, I think, that Jesus is trying to get across to Peter in this little bitty story. And I want us to look at each of these 3 points and think about the implications of them a little bit deeper. First of all, notice that Jesus tries not to offend. Now, does that shock us? As we've been reading through Matthew, we've noticed that fairly often people are offended by Jesus, right? I mean, pretty much since Matthew chapter 11, Jesus said to the disciples of John, blessed are those who are not offended by me. And then since that point, over and over again, people have been offended by Jesus. How is this different? Why now does Jesus care about offending people? What's the difference between this and all the past offenses that he has given? Well, if you remember those offenses, you remember what Jesus was doing. In each of those situations, he's standing up for those who are weak or those who are helpless. You remember how Jesus is being condemned and his disciples are condemned for gleaning on the Sabbath day. And Jesus speaks up and says, no, that's no big deal. David did this. It's not a big deal. He's standing up for his disciples and the truth so that his disciples can eat on the Sabbath day. He heals on the Sabbath day. Why? Well, somebody's suffering on the Sabbath day. He doesn't care about offending people or upsetting people. Someone is suffering. He's gonna gladly offend them in order to help those who are suffering. And he does this over and over again. Remember the washing of the hands, the fasting of his disciples. I mean, there's a number of things that they're offended by, and Jesus just reveals the truth to them and lets them be offended. But now he doesn't. In this case, we see Jesus gladly suffering personal loss to avoid being offensive towards someone else. Do you see the difference? In one case, it seems as though he's trying to help other people. In both cases, the person doesn't understand the truth. The Pharisees didn't understand the truth. This tax collector didn't understand the truth. But on the first instances, they're being oppressive and harsh toward other people, and so he doesn't mind. It's just, okay, you're going to be offended. I'm sorry. In this case, you've got a tax collector who's wrong. Jesus should not be taxed. But rather than offending him, he pays the tax, and he avoids being offensive. Isn't that kind of interesting? And how does that really apply to us? Are we offensive people? Are we offensive people? Are we seeking to be offensive toward other people? Well, I think most of us probably not so much, right? We don't really enjoy being offensive. Most of us kind of shy away from any kind of confrontation. We don't want to be offensive toward anybody else. We would rather just give them the shirt off of our back rather than them take offense. And so we really needed to hear all those first instances of Jesus being willing to offend somebody, to stand for the truth, and to stand up for somebody who's being oppressed. We needed to take all of that information in if we don't want to offend anybody. But maybe some of us, especially those of us who have social media, are inclined to let our opinions be known and to reveal what the truth is for those who don't know it. Maybe we're sometimes tempted to get frustrated whenever people are disrespectful toward us and don't recognize who we are. And maybe they are encroaching on us and trying to take something from us that's ours. And maybe then we don't mind being offensive toward those who have wronged us. Well, they deserve it. Notice that Jesus doesn't force the truth down the throat of other people. This is not Jesus' way of doing things. He is not an offensive person. Even as he offends earlier in the book of Matthew, it's not because he's shoving the truth down their throats. He's just living his life. He's trying to help people. He's trying to do his mission, and people are being offended. And it's not because he's trying to offend them. It's because they just are. Because they have evil in their own hearts. Jesus is not seeking to offend anybody. And that's why the leaders had such a hard time condemning him. Hopefully we see that by being offensive, we make it harder for those who are already going to be struggling to receive the truth, to actually find the truth. And Jesus doesn't want to put any additional blocks before them to keep them from accepting the truth of who he is. He doesn't feel so entitled, or he doesn't think so much about his life or everything that he must receive on earth and all his glory that he's worthy of. He doesn't care about that. He just wants to fulfill his mission. He wants souls to be saved. His message is offensive enough. He doesn't need to be offensive in addition to that. Hopefully we can learn a lesson there from Jesus and work on how we treat people who may be hurting us or doing something against us that we don't really appreciate. Jesus was willing to take it, and he's willing to give of himself to avoid being offensive toward other people. Next, notice how Jesus is not really worried. You know, if he's just come back from this trip to Caesarea Philippi, he's been to Tyre, he's been all over the place, and I mean, I don't know for sure, but it kind of seems like they don't really have any money. And you know, if I was there and I didn't have much money, you know, we've been working and doing all this work for the Lord, and I find, you know, I don't really owe anything on this tax, and then Peter comes in and says, hey, they asked about the tax, and I told them we were going to pay, and we're going to pay, right? And I'm like, dude, the money bag's empty. We have nothing. I might chew out Peter for agreeing to it because, hey, I don't even need to pay this tax. Like, you need to go find it yourself. But Jesus doesn't even waver at all in this. And this miracle shows how God is still in control, right? Jesus is reminding Peter, God is in control of all the blessings, all the things that come to us. We don't need to worry about how much money we have or what we have, because God can provide it, and he does provide it for them. And so as we think about this, we need to think about ourselves. Do we trust God to provide? Or do we get anxious? Do we get worried about where our money is going to come from? Are we worried about the future? I want us to just take a second and imagine the work of God in this fish. Here's a little fish swimming around, minding his own business, and he gets a command from God. I want you to go over here and I want you to take this shekel. Okay. Now hold it in your mouth, and I want you to go grab this hook. And he goes and grabs the hook, and hold that shekel in your mouth. Don't let it go. Don't swallow it. And he gets caught and pulled up out of the water, and he gets to give the shekel to Peter that's going to pay for Jesus and Peter's tax. God was working in the fish to create a means for paying the tax. God can work in this. If he can do that, what's too hard for him? What can't he do? And we need to let this sink into our minds as we worry and worry about whether or not we're going to have enough money in the future. God can bring the means that we need through anything he wants to. And he's done it for me over and over again. And I'm sure if you really sat down and thought about it, he's probably done it for you over and over again. He does that. So why in the world will we be worried about the future? See, a fear of the future shows a distrust in God's goodness and God's ability. And we need to get away from that as much as possible. And I love how this text shows us that Jesus has an endless supply of money available to him. I mean, he can have as much money as he really wanted to have, right? I mean, God is with him, and if he really wanted a lot of money, he could go after that. But that's not really what he's there for. That's not really what he cares about. And so we ought to not really be so focused on our money either. This is kind of a side lesson to this story. But I want us to notice and think about how our worry cripples our ministries and all the work that we're doing. We're just so focused on our future. We're so focused on our money. Whenever somebody comes up asking for money, we're thinking, well, I've only got this much, and I'm afraid that I won't have enough to do that or this, and I can't give you any right now. Well, we're not thinking right. We're not thinking about the fact that our breath, our life, our food, our ability, our gifts, everything comes from God. And he can provide it for us again tomorrow. And he can give us everything that we need. Or he can take it all away if he wants to. We need to develop a trust that God is there. He's providing and he's able to do more abundantly than we even ask or think. But the third lesson is really what this whole thing's about. As I started out talking about freedom and how do we view freedom, I want us to really notice this about Jesus, that Jesus just gives up his freedom. He just gives it up. He doesn't want to be offensive, and so he gladly lets go of his freedom. Now, as we read the word tax, maybe we're tempted to think about Jesus later on saying, render to Caesar what is Caesar's and render to God what is God's. But really, that's not the point of this text at all. That's coming up in chapter 22. This is a different kind of tax than that, and that's not really what Jesus is trying to say here. I'm just going to gladly give up my money to serve this temple. No, it's not really what this is about. But Jesus is showing us that he's willing to give up his freedom and what he deserves. As I said before, he is the temple of God. This money should actually be going to him. He should be receiving money. He shouldn't be broke. He should be exalted. He should be king. Everybody should be kissing his feet and throwing their gold before his feet. But Jesus doesn't use his freedoms. Jesus doesn't use what God has clearly given him, sonship, and the recognition that he is the Son of God. He doesn't abuse it, use it. He doesn't hold it over other people. He doesn't force other people to submit and do everything that he wants them to do. He just lets them tax him. Isn't that an amazing statement? But ultimately, doesn't that point us to what he did on the cross? This is just a small glimpse of what he's doing on the cross. Here he is, a man who is innocent, who is deserving of praise and glory and honor, who has healed countless people, who has fed countless people, and he gives up his life so that other people can live. This little story tells us the ways of Jesus and how he views his freedom. He lets it go because he has a greater purpose in mind. He's not here to serve himself. He's here to serve us, to serve others. So he doesn't really care about his freedom. He's not all about his freedom. He's not trying to maintain his freedom and trying to make sure he has the best possible life. He gladly gives it up so that other people can experience true freedom. And this is what he wants us to have, is true freedom. See, there's another freedom besides the freedoms that we enjoy in this country. There's a freedom that God offers to all of mankind. And we read about that in Romans chapter 8, There is now, therefore, no condemnation for those who are in Christ Jesus, for the law of the Spirit has set us free from the law of sin and death. We've been set free from the death that we deserve and the sin that ensnares us and entangles us and enslaves us if we are in Christ Jesus. He also said this in John chapter 8 as he spoke to the Pharisees. He told them that the truth, if they abide in him, then they will be free, and that the truth will set them free. And we can experience true freedom in Christ. Freedom that extends beyond what this earth can provide. Freedom that says we're free from all past sins. Everything we've ever done that has been against God has been removed and wiped clean, and the blood of Christ covers all of our future sins as well, so long as we remain faithful. That's available to everybody on this earth. So how are we supposed to view the freedoms of this earth that are taken away from us? How are we supposed to think about those freedoms? As Clay mentioned in his prayer, the blessings of God dwarf all the blessings that are here on this earth. Can't be thinking about my freedom as though it's something that I've got to keep no matter what. I have to be free in America because America's the free country. The only freedom that matters is the freedom God gives us. And they can take away every other freedom. But nothing and no one can take away the freedom God gives us. Because we are sons and daughters of the King. He makes us that way. It's so sad that we care more about our freedoms that are here on this earth than we care about the souls who are around us. And that we're willing to offend people, put stumbling blocks before the gospel to preserve our freedoms. That shouldn't be the case. You know, Peter learned this from this story. We know so because 1 Peter has Peter actually telling everybody this exact same idea. In 1 Peter chapter 2, I'll start with verse 12. Well, let's start with verse 11. It says, "Beloved, I urge you as sojourners and exiles to abstain from the passions of the flesh which wage war against your soul. Keep your conduct among the Gentiles honorable, so that when they speak against you as evildoers, they may see your good deeds and glorify God on the day of visitation." Now, you pause there. Peter's just simply saying, don't be offensive. Don't give in to the passions of your flesh to be offensive toward people who wrong you. Instead, keep your conduct honorable. And he says, be subject. Verse 13, for the Lord's sake, to every human institution, whether it be to emperor, supreme, the governors sent by him to punish those who do evil and praise those who do good. For this is the will of God, that by doing good you should put to silence the ignorance of foolish people. Live as people who are free, not using your freedom as a cover-up for evil, but living as servants of God. Honor everyone. Love the brotherhood. Fear God. Honor the emperor. Servants, be subject to your masters with all respect, not only to the good and gentle, but also to the unjust. For this is a gracious thing. When mindful of God, one endures sorrows while suffering unjustly. What credit is it if when you sin and are beaten for it, you endure? But if when you do good and suffer for it, you endure, this is a gracious thing in the sight of God. Now listen to this. For to this you have been called, because Christ also suffered for you, leaving you an example so that you might follow in his steps. He committed no sin, neither was deceit found in his mouth. When he was reviled, he did not revile in return. When he suffered, he did not threaten, but continued entrusting himself to him who judges justly. He himself bore our sins in his body on the tree, that we might die to sin and live to righteousness. By his wounds you've been healed. For you were straying like sheep, but have now returned to the shepherd and overseer of your souls. You see how Peter is pointing out that even though we live in a society that enjoys seeking their own and fighting for their rights and their freedoms, he points out that Jesus didn't do that. And because Jesus didn't do that, he won us over. And this is how we win other people over. We don't fight for our rights and our freedoms. We give them up gladly so that others might be saved. If you're here this morning and you've not received the grace of God, I want you to know God offers you a life of endless freedom and liberty in His Son. We're here to glorify God. We're here to bring souls to Christ. And we have all the freedom from sin and death that we need to live with Him forever in eternity. But all the freedoms of this earth are temporary, and they can be taken away. So what are you going to put your trust in? You can either put your trust in this earth and all the freedoms that are here, and you can be pursuing that with everything that's inside of you, or you can pursue the freedom that we don't deserve, but the freedom that has been offered to us because Christ gave His life for us. Will we humbly submit to His will and stop using our freedoms for evil? If you're here this morning and you're ready to do that and we can help you in some way, please come forward as we stand and as we sing.